Доброго вечора, ми з України.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Ushanka Show. I'm your host, Sergey Sputnikov. Здравствуйте, дорогие товарищи. In today's video, I would like to comment this interesting statement from Greek Kami. If you, my friend, think that without the USSR, your grandparents would have a life as good as the Americans in the 80s, then there isn't a whole lot that one can say. Okay, so let's talk about my grandparents and try to imagine how their life would go without the USSR. So here's my grandparents, Grandpa Sergey and Grandmother Maria. Both were born in 1907, grew up and lived in northern Ukraine. So they're grandparents on my mother's side, which you could see in this photo. That's my mama Yelena. She was born in 1948. So this photo was taken probably sometimes in the middle of 1950s. If you remember Soviet history, October Revolution happened in 1917, so they were 10-year-olds at that time. And quite a few people were asking if I remember any stories of their life before the revolution. Not really. When I was a kid, I was mostly interested in my grandpa's stories from the World War II. So unfortunately, there is no information that I know of about their life before the revolution. Of course, you need to keep in mind that lived in northern Ukraine, kind of out middle of nowhere. So the events of what was going on in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, even in Kiev, didn't affect a lot of the villages. They probably didn't have anything happen big time till early 1930s when Stalin began his policy of collectivization. My grandpa was drafted to Red Army. At that time it was called РККК. So it's Рабочая Крестьянская Красная Армия, the Red Army of Workers and Peasants. I only have this little photo of him and no information, unfortunately. So that's sometimes around 1927. If I recall correctly, they got married sometimes around 1929, and my uncle Misha was born in 1930, and my mother was born in 1948, 18 years later. So she was like a oops kid. Like in recall, they weren't planning to have a second kid, but it just happened. According to my mother, my grandfather's family was well-to-do peasants. They were renting land from the local landlord. They had several horses, so they were doing fine, but they weren't really rich because when my grandpa got married, he actually got permission to take apart an old barn in order to build his own log cabin. Then, of course, they had collectivization of early 1930s. When they had to bring their animals, horses, to the collective farm and work together at the collective farm for free. And I remember stories of my grandpa that he was guarding the grain barn. I think I already told that story. And they were starving, so while his brother was watching, my grandpa would crawl under a barn, drill the hole, and they were draining grain through that hole so they could feed their families. In June of 1941, Germany attacked Soviet Union. My grandpa, of course, was drafted. He became prisoner of war in less than a month. He escaped, got caught again, was sent to Germany when he spent the rest of the war, first being in a POW camp. Later, local farmers were looking for helpers. And since my grandpa had skills, he was a blacksmith and he was had experience with horses and worked at the farm. He ended up working for the local farmer, and he did pretty good. He wasn't ever complaining about working for that German farmer. He was liberated in 1945 by the Americans, and I think he had a chance to go to America, but of course his wife, my grandma, was home with their son, so he wanted to go back. So he was transferred to the Soviet side. He went into the filtration camp, which was ran by NKVD. And since he was a traitor, according to the Red Army standards, because Stalin didn't accept the concept of POWs, he was sent to the labor camp in Donetsk region, Donbass, rebuilding destroyed coal mines. And that's where he almost died from starvation and from being overworked. His wife basically saved his life. She managed to get a paper from their collective farm that he desperately needed. And she traveled to Donetsk region with that document, and she managed to get him out of that labor camp. He was barely alive, covered with lice. I already told that story, so that's how he returned back to the village where he spent the rest of his life working for a local collective farm. And here's the picture of my grandpa. He's the second from the left at that blacksmith shop. And I know this photo looks like it's 1800s, but it's actually sometimes around early 1960s. They still had to fix parts of the wooden wheels for their horse buggies and stuff like that. You're probably familiar with the concept of the collective farm kolkhoz. So it's kind of like an agriculture cooperative. Everyone works, then you sell your produce, and if you have any profit left, that's what you can split among the workers. The problem of the system in the Soviet Union, they had only one single customer, Soviet government. And of course, government wanted to purchase the produce at the lowest price possible because that produce will go to the cities to feed the workers, and the workers wanted low prices. So peasants were always squeezed. Collective farms weren't making any profits, and so they weren't paying their workers, while peasants were required to work regardless at the collective farm. It was their duty and responsibility, and I already had videos about it. I'll post links below in the comment section. And since collective farm wasn't making any money, they were compensating their workers, their members of collective farm, with items like hay or straw, potatoes, grain, and I had a video about it too. That'll be in the link below this video. The problem with that they were poor all their life because they had to work virtually for free for a collective farm. When it was time to retire, your pension is based on your salaries, and since there was no salary, my grandma, for example, was getting the minimal pension was only 12 rubles per month, and for 12 rubles you could purchase 4 bottles of vodka. I always do everything in the vodka currency to give you an idea. So picture your pension, $80 a month. Of course, if you live off your land, you don't need a lot of money, so they barely had any money. The easiest explanation of their lifestyle, they were pretty much Soviet Amish. They had electricity and wired radio. They had no refrigerator, no TV. They used the cellar to store the foodstuffs. My grandpa purchased a little moped in the 70s. Otherwise, everything was really primitive, basic. And this is one of my favorite photos of my grandparents. So this is sometime around 1979, maybe 1980. My grandparents, coming from the forest after they harvested firewood all day long, they had to borrow a horse and a telega, so it's like a horse buggy, to bring that firewood home. So this is the lifestyle of people in the country that had a nuclear capacity, that sent people to space, created the first space station, while their peasants spent all summer, retired peasants, harvesting hardwood and bringing it by horse back to their home. And that's how my grandma was spending retirement days, chopping firewood so they could stay warm in the winter. And of course, we helped them a lot. I was helping my grandpa to cut firewood in smaller chunks so they can be chopped. But here's the real kicker. So this is the art from 1891 that shows the Russian or Ukrainian peasant with his telega, with his horse buggy. And here's my grandparents almost 100 years later using exactly same telega, using the horsepower to bring firewood. Fun fact, in Soviet Union there were 12 horse buggy building factories. The largest of them was the factory called Smena in the town of Borovichi in the Novgorod region. In 1980s, it was still manufacturing around 2,000 horse buggies per month. We call it telega. They were shipped all over the Soviet Union, and it was manufacturing two kinds. One, this ancient type with wooden wheels for 200 rubles retail, and upgraded one with the rubber wheels for 450 rubles per month. Isn't it crazy that it was manufactured in the Soviet Union, in the country of developed socialism, all the way into the 80s? Now let's take a look at this interesting poster I found. So this is from 1922, and on the top it says, "This is how it was," and on the bottom, this is how it will be. So this is how the future of the Soviet peasants looked back in 1922, before collectivization, before the collective farms. So we're going back into the future. This is sometimes around 1980, so 60 years later. My father helping his in-laws plowing the fields, not with that cool motorized motorblock, but with horses and the plow. And looking back at that 1922 poster that claimed this is how it was, and this is how nothing changed for the peasants of the Soviet Union. So if we return back to the comment by the Greek commie that if I think that without the USSR your grandparents would have a life as good as the Americans, I don't know about as good as the Americans, but definitely they will have it better than they had under the Soviet Union, because in 100 years or 70 years since the Soviet Union existed, nothing changed in a good way. Actually, I'm wrong. Something did change. Before the revolution, peasants had their own horses and they plowed their own fields. After the revolution, like my grandparents had to go and ask for permission to use a collective farm horse to plow their fields. So that's the only change. They still plowed the fields with the horses. It's just they used to have their own horse. Now they had to ask for a horse from the collective farm. But if you look at the part of the comment that my grandparents' life would be as good as the Americans in the 80s, that's a tough one. First of all, my grandpa was extremely organized and smart person. Even with that lifestyle and being paid so poorly, he still managed to save 3,000 rubles, and selling some meat, and they were selling some baby pigs on the market. So even in those conditions, he managed to save a lot of money, which we used to buy our apartment in the 80s. I can only guess how he will be doing if he had his own farm and doing his own thing and being paid for his labors. It's hard to say. And the rest, of course, is alternative history. What about if Russia wouldn't collapse after World War I and socialism will never comes to the country? That's question number one. Or the other alternative, if Russia did collapse but Ukraine managed to remain independent from Bolshevik Russia. If you know, in 1919, Ukraine announced its own independence. It was Ukrainian People's Republic, UNR, was created. But unfortunately, Lenin and Bolsheviks came to Ukraine and managed to occupy it. And then there will be no collectivization, so that's a huge plus. And the whole topic of World War II is quite interesting to discuss from the perspective of alternative history. Will Tsar Russia make a deal with Nazi Germany like Stalin did? Will they sign a pact of a non-aggression? Will they together attack Poland? Or will Tsar Russia will go a different route and make a pact with France, its allies in World War I, and England, and jointly fight against Hitler? Maybe World War II even wouldn't happen, or not at such a grand scale. But at any rate, the communist government brought nothing but misery and poverty to the Soviet peasants, people like my grandparents, because they forced them to work for free at the collective farms. They had to survive off their tiny plots of land. They had no rights. They had no passports till 1970s, so they even weren't technically citizens of the Soviet Union because you weren't allowed to leave your own village because you didn't have a passport. Would my grandparents do as well as Americans in the 80s? Who knows? Look what happened to the agriculture of Ukraine and Russia after the collapse of Soviet Union in 1991. Russia became #1 producer of grain in the world. Ukraine became a number 5. Without collective farms, without 5-year plans, they started way more productive and they started feeding the world. Before that, Soviet Union couldn't feed its own people and had to buy millions of dollars of wheat just so we have bread to eat in the Soviet Union. And you know what's sad? Back when I lived in the Soviet Union, it was a completely normal thing. When you leave the city, like every summer I went to the village to spend my summer break, it was totally normal for me. You leave the city and it's like you go back 50 years or maybe even more, because you arrive in a village and your grandparents don't have running water. They use outhouse. They have to use horses for anything they do. And I kind of enjoy it to have this rustic lifestyle. But now, as an adult, I'm looking back like, oh my goodness, what a miserable life they had. They worked all their lives, they weren't paid, and nothing good happened in their lives. And it was totally normal, in my understanding of that situation. It's only when I came to America first time in 1995 and I saw farmers here in the United States, and I walked in a farmer's house and my jaw dropped because I see this beautiful large home, huge stone fireplace. The guy has orchards, trucks, tractors, and I was like, holy crap. This is how the farmers live in America. And then I compared it to my grandparents, and that's when I started realizing that something was wrong with the Soviet picture. And of course, the straw that broke my back, and I made a video about it, is when I visited Amish people and we had a dinner at their place. And me, being naive, I asked where their outhouse is located, because, people live without electricity. They should have outhouse. And they actually got kind of, I won't say butthurt, but not happy with my question, because they're like, no, we have an indoor plumbing. Just go down the hallway, bathroom on the left, and they had totally normal bathroom with running water. And I just like, even American Amish that refuse, because of their religious beliefs, to use electricity and modern conveniences, they don't use cars and other stuff, telephones, they still have running water in their houses, while my grandparents lived in the advanced socialism, had to use outhouse all their lives. Okay, my friends, that's all I have for today. Sorry about this rant. I just kind of got all fired up talking about this topic. As always, I love to hear your comments. Please post your comments below this video, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye.